So this talk, listen, my goal is, to be honest, is to break the UFO cover-up. And I've been working with the UFO community and on UFO Twitter and a research community to try to figure out, are we being lied to and what actually happened? So first, if there was a cover-up, which we're pretty sure, with a high degree of probability that there was a cover-up, well, what happened? Why is there a cover-up? And so when Lou Elizondo started talking in public about, yeah, UFOs are real, sorry, you're right. And he was talking to people in conferences and stuff like that. I'm like, wait a second, if they're real, I thought they weren't real. If they're real, then that means all of history is, at least the last 75, 80 years is wrong. And so I just want to emphasize this presentation is not copyrighted, it's public domain, so this is not my property. Anybody can use this in any documentary, a book, website, it doesn't matter. And so this is a dense presentation. I'm going to go as fast as I can through it. Here, I am an open source software developer. I've been programming since 1985. I've licensed a bunch of software for use in video games. I've written data compression technology used on Google Maps. I've worked on some very large video games. I've worked at SpaceX. I've worked on Starlink. I was CTO of a company in Dallas. It was acquired by Netflix. And I'm still working on open source software. That's my day job. I went to the Seoul conference last year, and I've released a bunch of open source data on GitHub, and I have a little website where you can search that at ufo-search.com. And okay, so about the data that we've been able to gather. And in our world, we look at the world as a system. And this system is recording data constantly. And so if history has been corrupted, then what we want to do is go back in time to the old archives that have been either just ignored or never been digitized, and go try to figure out how to put a proper view of history back together. And so what we've done is we've compiled a very large repository of data. We don't own most of this data. And so what we're doing is we're putting it in a chronology. And there was a book author named Charles Fort back in the 20s and 30s who was one of the first people to do this kind of work. He went through a whole bunch of newspapers, and he compiled 50,000 newspaper clippings by hand over many years. And these were about anomalies. They were about UFOs and weird sightings and things falling from the sky, just a whole wide variety of things. And so anyway, this data that we've compiled is not just UFO sightings, but it's also abductions, mutilations, murders, cold cases, you name it, just a wide variety of things. So, but we think it's all related in some way to the UFO phenomena, but not necessarily all of them. Some of these are just cold cases. And so anyway, so a lot of this data comes from famous people, famous organizations, and some unknown people, chronologers from France. We also have some chronologers from South America as well. We translated some of this stuff using OpenAI. Okay. So this is I'm going to give you my overall impressions of after looking at this for around 2.5 years. The first thing is I want to say that the true history of radar has been suppressed and has been classified as far as we can determine. Dr. Donald Menzel, who was a key figure in the UFO cover-up, had a fellow who had a secret life, according to physicist Stanton Friedman. He discovered that in the 80s. He discovered he had a crypto clearance, and it was never revealed. To this day, you can go to Wikipedia, and that's just all suppressed. We discovered that Donald Menzel was actually involved in that in 1949. We found that in a French chronology. We had to translate it. We're still researching this, but his name pops up. So anyway, Stanton Friedman always would say, radar, rockets, nukes are super important to the UFO problem. And he said this on video. And so that was like, wow, I was like, that's really interesting. Why would radar be useful? Why should we look at radar? Why should we look at rockets and nukes as well? And so Dr. James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist, it was unfortunate that he was hounded to his death, and he committed suicide because of the cover-up. Turns out he was right. We found some papers of his which had data about sightings in 1947, and we found corroborative data. We found a whole bunch of it, actually. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. And so if you look at the actual archives on this planet, the summer of 1947, all hell broke loose. June 21st, this massive signal comes out of nowhere. And then June 24th, which was Kenneth Arnold's, the aviator, famous sighting in Washington, it explodes. And I'll show you graphs in a little bit. It zooms out of nowhere. If you search for, quote, flying saucer in newspaper archives before Kenneth Arnold, there's like virtually zero signal. It has nothing to do with UFOs. It's actually saucers, like kitchen stuff, that's it. And it's super rare that phrase would pop up. It had nothing to do with UAP. Okay, so I have some, so all hell breaks loose, and it appears after doing a bunch of analysis that there was some sort of containment strategy and information suppression strategy. And I have some links in there. I'm going to put all these slides online in a few hours so people can go look at them at home, and there's a lot of links in these slides too. So every single thing in here is attributed and referenced as much as I could. So it turns out that this whole presentation also is about there is some Vatican involvement, so David Grush is right. It clearly comes through in a lot of these incidents. So this is part 2 of the overall impression of the data. Local New Mexico newspapers around the time of Roswell, there's very strange activity reported all around White Sands during that time. Strange metals were reported to fall. And so I went and we have names. So once we have a name, we can we can build their family tree. Remember, this is people from 7 years ago, so it's actually fairly easy. The data is on various databases like Ancestry.com. We can go research these names, and we can figure out did they ever have any criminal activity, what's their background, whatever. And it turns out the person who reported the metals falling near White Sands was involved in New Mexico politics. He had a squeaky clean record as far as we could determine. So late 40s and 50s, there was a cat and mouse game between pro and anti-disclosure forces. You can clearly see that the people of the United States knew they were being lied to, and they actually set up the Air Force. And we actually have audio tapes of this. They're on YouTube now where, believe it or not, a famous book author I'm going to introduce in a little bit called Frank Scully, him and his buddies in Denver, but Frank was around here in California, Southern California. They actually set a FOCI up. And they brought in a FOCI agent. Somehow they got an FOCI agent to interview a Radio Times salesman. Never interview a man in a radio station because they're going to have recording equipment. So anyway, I'll cover that in a little bit. Yeah, so there's a containment strategy used. And actually I use that word is actually from a Majestic document. Those were some documents that were either leaked or hoaxed or a combination. We don't really know in the 80s and 90s. But this containment strategy seems to emerge. As you keep researching this, you'll see that in this cat and mouse game, one of the things that the anti-disclosure forces would do is suppress, the news wires, suppress information and things like that, prevent UFO reports from appearing in newspapers. So as far as I can determine, is that UAPs were both intimidation, a form of intimidation, over our most sensitive airspaces, and specifically 6 and 7, 1947, that's Roswell at the time period. Farmington, New Mexico, 400 to 500 UAPs were spotted by half the town, about 5,000 people, a lot of high-quality witnesses. The entire telephone exchange was called by newspapers, and it was reported in national news wires. So a whole town in New Mexico was overflown for about a week, approximately. They did their best to contain it, but it got out anyway over the wires. So anyway, everybody probably familiar with this would know that Washington, D.C. was overflown on 7/1952. It was actually overflown on 8/1952 as well, a month later, but that was suppressed. But it does emerge in the chronology we have. So it turns out we're in a state of mass amnesia. There's a lot of data out there, a lot of stuff that indicates all these things happened, and it weaves together like true history would. So, also, in my opinion, there seems to be some sort of intervention, and here's the thing. When I was looking at this chronology, this 55,000 set of events, I kept finding cases where people would claim that they were talking to some entity telepathically or whatever, and a message would be delivered with a warning that we were abusing nuclear technology, that we were poisoning our planet, and then we need to stop. This keeps coming through in this chronology. It's unmistakable. You can't miss it. Okay, yeah, anyway, as you go through, everything's getting digitized now. So you can clearly see anybody who spends time in Project Sign, Grudge, or Blue Books records, that was the U.S. government's investigative program back then. Investigative, put in quotes, more like a containment strategy. They're bunk. They're ridiculous. If you can go through them, they contradict themselves. But they are useful, and I'll give you some examples of that in a bit. Okay, Mitch recommended I put together a timeline, but this is so complicated. I don't know how much this really helps, but you're on the right. You are here. This is 2024. This is controlled disclosure. And then all the way to the left, we have World War II for U.S., for around Pearl Harbor. And so for what I'm going to quickly go to just a little overview on this. So World War II, some key events would be 1941. Dr. Donald Menzel works on the math behind the radar bounce off the moon, which was done in, I'm quoting, in absolute secrecy. And then we have, of course, A-bombs, and we have an organization, a key organization called BSRA, the Borderland Sciences. And so I've also released a search engine. It's live right now. It's UFO-search.com. This is also open source. This allows you to search this database anytime you want on your phone.